The case of James Fry, which I mentioned earlier, takes us in the opposite direction. Initially, he tried to peddle his story of, sort of descent into drug addiction and petty crime as a novel. It was a story that was interesting, but he wisely thought that he could make it a little bit more interesting by fictionalizing and embellishing it and then slapping a novel on the cover and letting the reading public's tendency to read fiction as autobiography just infer that he was this dangerous man who all this horrible stuff had happened to. But rather than ending up doing it that way, he and his publishers ended up putting it forward as plain old memoir, a story that is certified to be 100% true. Now, since the whole motivation for this was to satisfy the reader's insatiable hunger to know the horrible truths that lie at the hearts of books, it was entirely appropriate that this caused a huge scandal in which the truth was painstakingly separated from the fiction. And when it came out that most of the really awful behavior Fry described in his book was completely made up. Now, in my book, what I've sort of tried to do is just already separate the fact from the fiction. It's sort of pre-separated for you, for the reader's convenience. Now, 150 years ago, the transgressions of Fry might have gone undenounced. In a recent book that was really fascinating called Memoir, A History by the critic Ben Yagoda, he made the point that 150 years ago in the 19th century, there was an even wider outbreak of fraudulent memoirs and unreliable autobiographies. But unless they were about a subject matter that was very, very charged, like slavery, there was many slave narratives whose memoirs, whose authenticity were challenged. But unless a memoir was about a highly charged subject like that, the reading public just didn't seem to greatly care. Nowadays, however, we have a very different reading public, and there's very little indication, at least to my eye, that these scandals of the past few years have changed that impulse on the part of readers. We are capable, as Americans, I think, of turning anything that we desire into kind of a commodity, and now that process seems to have attached itself to reality in our books. So we've become consumers of reality now. But all of this questing after the truth and all these theories about reality, they obscure what I think is the greatest form of truth to be found in any book, and that is the writer's voice, what I mentioned earlier. Because voice has really no allegiance to anything but itself. It turns out that it's the one intangible and untouchable element in any book, that which cannot be cornered by fact checkers or marketers or a reality-obsessed reader. It's free of fact. It's free of fantasy. It's fair game for the reader and for the writer. And embedded in that peculiar arrangement of words that a reader chooses to represent him or herself on the page is a truth that really transcends the boundaries of fact and fiction and delivers the thing that I go looking for in a book, and I think most readers do, and that's the contours of another human soul. In the book that I've written, the experiment really was to sort of see what it would be like to alternate between fact and fiction and really have the only constant, that thread that runs through all of them, be voice. That as you sort of have to hold on to it because there's nothing else to hold on to as you go back and forth. And you perhaps begin to think about its primacy over all these other genres and boundaries. That's all I wanted to say about the book and the reading. I wanted to leave a little bit of time for questions because I know that people will have or may have questions also about the magazine and magazine work. So I wanted to leave a little extra time for that. Thank you very much, and please ask me any question you want, including questions about the casino in Reno. Yes?
Would you read something in the book, in the same voice that
Oh, sure. Okay, just give me 1 second to think about this. Well, yeah, I mean, see, I think that the interesting thing about voice in nonfiction is that it's where a writer actually does get to, a nonfiction writer, a factual writer, using facts gets to create something that is imagined. The way that we as writers put our words together is a work of imagination, even if we're writing factual work. I think obviously you have far less license than if you're a fictional writer, but again, it's that representation of self on the page is still a matter of the imagination. So, I mean, I would say that the character that narrates the nonfiction is as real and unreal as the character that narrates the fiction. Ooh. Yes. All right, let's see. I could read a chapter that's from earlier in the book. So the chapter that I read was from chapter 3, which begins in New Orleans, which is where I discovered this poetry competition, and then flew to Reno, actually just 4 days after 9/11, which is a whole other thing in that chapter, which is kind of crazy, to enter this competition. But prior to that, the book begins in West Texas, in the little town of Marfa, Texas, where I moved in 1999 to take a job as a small-town newspaper reporter. And the first couple chapters are out there, and then the book ends out there. And in some ways, that's kind of that's I think of as the setting of the book, even though it bounces around elsewhere. So maybe I'll read to you from the the very beginning of chapter 2, which is the first appearance of any fiction in this work. Okay, so this is about my stumbling onto the attempt to write a masterful work of nonfiction, a magazine article about the drought in West Texas, which ultimately ended in failure on my part. Our acquaintance, or my acquaintance with the local ranching, several of the local ranchers, began innocently enough with an article for the February 3rd, 2000 issue of the Big Bend Sentinel entitled "Drought Taking a Toll on Ranching." In the previous 3 years, local gauges had recorded an average of just 4.5 inches of rain per year, the worst output in history. Cows were starving, crops perishing, every month another operation went bust. I was sent out with my notebook to take the measure of the pain. By this point, Halperin, who's the editor of the paper, Robert Halperin, truly the editor of the newspaper out there. By this point, Halperin had quit dispatching me to school board and city council meetings. I had a tendency, exacerbated no doubt by the stresses, well, there's going to be some things here that we'll just have to skate over. I had a tendency, exacerbated no doubt by the stresses and torsions of my maddening quest for Ambrose Bierce, to dwell on odd little details of a scene. The collection of snow globes on the superintendent's desk, the matching brown shoes worn by 3 out of 8 county commissioners, and overlook the actual news. The week that the city council had voted to limit the number of horses residents could keep within city limits, I had devoted most of my article to the belt buckles of the citizens who had signed up to speak against the motion. This led Halperin to decide that I would be better suited to feature writing. He assigned me profiles of a local paraplegic who painted with his toes, a cook who'd been churning out chicken fried steaks in chile verde at Mondo's for 30 years, and a beekeeper. For the drought story, I spent 2 weeks roaming the dustlands around Marfa, peering into ranches that looked like giant sandboxes, drinking burnt coffee with the man at the ag office, reminiscing about old dry spells with cowhands at Carmen's, and kicking the dirt with young, anxious cattlemen leveraged up to their eyeballs. It's just one paragraph.